We would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations as the traditional owners of the land on which the university stands. Respectfully recognize elders past, present, and future.
Welcome to Newsline, a collaboration between journalism and screen and media students at RMIT.
Brought to you live from the RMIT Melbourne's media portal. Welcome to the program. I'm Faith Makale.
And I'm Matt Harvey. Today on the program, we'll see some stories about urban development in Melbourne and take a look at the issues unfolding in aged care facilities.
And we'll also have updates across sport, finance, and weather. But first, to today's headlines.
Victoria's COVID cases have reached a national daily record of 2,297 overnight, with 11 deaths. Despite the record high, Victoria is on track to hit its double vaccination target as early as next week. That's 12 days ahead of the date predicted in the roadmap. The speedy progress is due to increased pop-up clinics at cafes, gyms, and shopping strips. COVID Response Commander Jerome Weimer says the vaccine numbers were always expected to lift around this time.
There is heaps of vaccine available. So, and I think as we've been talking about entirely through the vaccination programme, it was always going to come in October and November. That's when the real volumes of vaccine start to arrive. We're burning through vaccine at a really high rate within the state clinic system. The GPs and community pharmacies are also going really hard now.
Melburnians could also know by the end of the week if lockdown will lift early.
Health authorities are preparing to reduce the self-isolation time for fully vaccinated VCE students who have been in close contact with a positive case. This is to help minimize instances of students being forced to sit out of their exams. Deputy Premier James Merlino says vaccination status will determine wait times.
That means they're in isolation for 7 days. For students who are unvaccinated, they're in isolation for 14 days, but they have an exemption to go and sit their exam. That's the critical announcement that we're making today.
We will hear more about the VCE exams and how the pandemic has affected Year 12 students later in the program.
AstraZeneca manufacturer CSL has denied reports it would stop vaccine production in Melbourne by the end of this year. The reports claim, due to the demand of Pfizer and Moderna, that CSL would stop production by Christmas. A spokesperson for CSL has confirmed that manufacturing will continue into next year and a full contract for 50 million doses will be met. Any excess jabs created are going to go to neighbouring countries under a decision made by the federal government and backed by CSL. Acting Chief Health Officer Ben Cowie said he was grateful for the amount of AstraZeneca Australia had received.
I guess my only reflection is it's been such a fundamental part of protecting Australians, and I'm just so grateful that we've had the opportunity to have that vaccine as part of our rollout, notwithstanding the fact that there has been complications, there's been rare but serious side effects associated with it, as there are with any medicine or vaccine.
New South Wales Independent MP Alex Greenwich will introduce a voluntary assisted dying bill today. Politicians from across the political spectrum have come together to co-sponsor the bill after a petition of 100,000 signatures was presented by lobby group Dying with Dignity. New South Wales Premier Dominic Perrottet, who is opposed to voluntary assisted dying, said he had no problem with the government members co-sponsoring the bill. And opposition leader Chris Minns said Labor MPs would be allowed to consign the vote, but he would not be supporting the bill.
Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte said the government believe the heir will not need to abdicate the throne if the Crown Princess decides to marry a person of the same sex. The Netherlands became the first country to legalise gay marriage in 2001.
The U.S. is investigating a possible case of Havana syndrome in its embassy in Colombia. Colombian President Ivan Duque says his government is aware of the cases and is leaving the investigation to Washington. ABC reported at least 5 families linked to the embassy in Colombia have shown symptoms associated with the mysterious illness. And that's all for headlines.
Now, onto our first story, where there are concerns about privacy issues around facial recognition apps. Sarah Liversidge has the story. Sarah, hello.
Hi, Matt. So, Australian human rights groups have raised privacy concerns over technologies to be used in home quarantine apps for Australians returning from overseas. I'm joined by Professor of Artificial Intelligence at the University of New South Wales, Toby Walsh.
So what have you got?
Good afternoon, Professor. Thanks for coming on the program. So, the Human Rights Law Centre and Digital Rights Watch have raised privacy concerns over apps to be used for home quarantine for Australians returning from overseas. Facial recognition and geolocation technologies are some of the main concerns. How valid are these concerns?
Very concerned about how these technologies get normalized into our lives. There are lots of concerns, the privacy concerns you mentioned, but also bias concerns. There are plentiful examples of how this technology is racially and gender biased.
Some people may have trouble accessing and using this technology. What can governments do to ensure people are included and not punished for this?
Yeah, inclusion is definitely a real concern here. There are plentiful examples of facial recognition software not recognizing black faces, and it's entirely unnecessary. We actually have a really good, robust technology that identifies people. It's at the bottom of your smartphone. It's the fingerprint reader. It doesn't suffer all of those biases. Try to test it. It doesn't pose as much of a risk. So it's really disappointing that the politicians reach for the latest fancy gee whiz bit of technology when there was actually something already there they could have used that wouldn't raise all these concerns.
15.
There have already been concerns over law enforcement accessing QR check-in data. How important is it that data gathered by these apps is not able to be used for outside purposes?
Yes, that's another concern. The regulation around this is for as long as the pandemic continues, they will keep the data. How long the pandemic continues, it may never end, actually. So it's not clear that they are going to get rid of the data. When we saw with the check-in apps, we've seen a number of police forces around Australia try and access the data, despite the promises that were given when the apps were introduced, that they would only be used for medical purposes. So we do have to be concerned, typically, you would want the legislation to be put in place in advance of the app being used, as opposed to promises being made post hoc.
So what can governments do to safeguard these apps and make sure they're designed and executed to satisfactory legal and ethical standards?
The Australian government doesn't have a very good track record in this space. The COVID Safe app cost a lot of money and hasn't really saved any lives at all, and I suspect this is going to be a similar disaster in the waiting. Indeed, it's really questionable whether we need an app like this at all. We look at other countries that are further ahead with living with COVID. Look at countries like the United Kingdom. They're no longer insisting on people doing home quarantining. They're using vaccination certificates and rapid testing, and that's likely how it's going to evolve here. So this is an unnecessary, unwanted, and poorly executed app.
Professor Walsh, thanks so much for your time. Back to you, Matt.
Thanks, Sarah. A former theatre in Collingwood is the scene of a battle between residents, Yarra City Council, and a developer who want to build more apartments. James Gaunt has more.
Across Melbourne, the city is still in the midst of the world's longest lockdown. Many shops are closed, but one that won't reopen is the Austral Theatre in Collingwood, which is due to be demolished to make way for high-rise apartments.
The building opened 100 years ago and was a theatre and cinema before, more recently, being used as a carpet store. While it has retained much of its original decor, plans for new apartments will see a partial demolition of the Austral building, with only the facade remaining, and residents are unimpressed. Matthew Carabot is one of almost 100 local residents who objected to the development.
So it was built in 1921, and 2021 we're looking to knock the thing down and put up what they term mid-rise. That's a fair few stories up.
Some of the residents' objections include the new building's proposed height, which residents fear could set a precedent for the area, a lack of social housing units being made available, and the removal of an 80-year-old elm tree at the rear of the property. While neither Yarra City Council nor the developer DPG returned requests for comment, residents have not been quiet and have gathered on social media to share their frustration over what they see as a significant letdown from a council who pride themselves on being green.
In some respects, some, not all people feel let down by the council, but some do. It's a shame to lose the heritage that formed part of the aspect of the area.
Last month, council approved the plans, with only minor alterations required. Even so, residents like Matthew say they aren't ready to give up their fight.
Unfortunately, this development is yet to be resolved, but it has left residents across Yarra frustrated with council members in what has been a challenging year for a council which has often found itself in the news for the wrong reasons. James Gaunt, RMIT Newsline.
We're heading to a short break now.
Coming up, we'll look at conditions in aged care facilities where private providers are deciding when to allow outside visitors.
And we follow up with communities in the Dandenongs where they're still recovering from massive storms. Stay with us. Welcome back to Newsline. Now to aged care.
Minister for Health and Aged Care Greg Hunt has encouraged providers to allow visitors, but when will it happen? Reporter Sam Matthews investigates.
Despite record case numbers here in Victoria, life is slowly returning to normal as vaccination rates continue to climb. But for residents in aged care homes, the roadmap out of lockdown isn't so clear. Many facilities are still barring visitors, despite high rates of vaccination amongst staff and residents. And this ongoing isolation is taking a serious toll.
The prevalence of mental health problems such as depression, anxiety, distress, loneliness have increased by nearly 50% amongst aged care residents. So the increase has been substantial, really, since the start of the pandemic.
Earlier this month, Health and Aged Care Minister Greg Hunt encouraged the states to relax visitor restrictions for the well-being of residents. But this means little to the private providers who run the majority of aged care homes in Australia. It is these individual providers who decide whether to allow visitors and under what circumstances.
It's been evident through the COVID pandemic how little the regulator and how little the government can actually do to control these individual businesses. It's very important to focus on the human rights of older people and the quality of life of older people living in aged care homes. That should be our focus. And if that is our focus, we would enable families to visit.
Premier Daniel Andrews has Victorians looking forward to a family Christmas this year. But for aged care residents and their families, uncertainty remains.
Every Christmas, we'd usually go to Nana's. And so for the past few years, that's been at the aged care facility. I don't see that happening this year, but I see maybe one or two of us being able to go see her, hopefully by then, by Christmas.
I'm Sam Matthews, reporting for RMIT Newsline.
And now we have reporter Emil Pavlich looking at the cost of flights as we open up. Emil?
Thanks, Matt. Australians looking to overseas in the coming months should be prepared to spend big, caused by high demand and low supply, experts warn. I'm joined today by Dr. Meg Elkins from the RMIT College of Business and Law. Thanks for coming onto the show, Dr. Elkins. So Australians are seeing that international travel could be fast-tracked in the coming months. What does that mean for the industry and what does that mean for our society?
Well, it's going to be interesting to see what happens to people. There's going to be some hesitation and some caution, and that depends on where people sit within that psychological spectrum of just wanting to get back to life as normal, get those feelings of openness to experience and doing new and exciting things. But there's going to be another section that will be very, very cautious of this moment to come out. And so it's looking at people that have already planned some level of holidays compared to those that are going to come at this a lot slower than other than other customers.
Yeah, so there are reports that flights could be pretty expensive once the borders open. What might be causing this?
Well, I think there's a degree of trepidation for people going out there. So maybe there's a lot of insurance that people have to pay in order to ensure that their holidays take place. We've had a lot of moments within Australia where holidays have been cancelled, bookings have been cancelled because of COVID restrictions. But there's an economic reason for this as well, and that is scarcity. If you've actually tried to book a flight yourself, you'll notice that you have to be really aware of where you're stopping over, and what used to be able to be where you could just, do an overnight stopover is not as simple these days. Now you have to ensure that you've got a safe transit and passage of travel. So this tends to mean that it's not as simple as it once was, and there's all these add-ons because of these COVID restrictions that we're needing to take account for.
Yeah, and I guess, do you expect the industry to sort of reach some pre-COVID capacity in the near future?
Oh, that's such a good question, Emil. I wonder if it's going to be different for different states, because some states have had these freedoms that haven't psychologically trapped them. My fear is that Victorians are going to be much more hesitant to come out because there's a habituation of just staying the way life was. We're now habituated to staying indoors, not meeting up with people, and we've got to break this mindset almost that we will have freedom soon. And I think that's going to take some time to get back to those same levels. And I'm not quite convinced that people will be aware of restrictions coming back as well. For example, home quarantine, hotel quarantine, what does that cost really? So the flight or the cost of a normal holiday is much higher in this COVID times.
Yeah, so I guess it's fair to say that you'd sum up by saying there might be a bit of travel hesitancy.
Yeah. But for some, there's just itching to go, right? I have a friend whose son is going to the UK today. He's getting on a flight at actually 4:20, and he's going over to launch his life in the UK. So there are people that have planned to go and that will go. But there are other people that will be much more psychologically reticent to get themselves out there again. And it's balancing those two elements. So when you talk about why prices are increasing, I think it's because things are not normal. And like everything in COVID, like the price of houses have gone up, the price of cars have gone up. There's scarcity here. There's not the availability that we had pre-COVID. And that's why prices are being pushed up.
Dr. Elkins, thank you very much for your time. Back to you, Faith.
Thanks, Emil. On to our next story. Victoria's council calls for assistance as it deals with the aftermath of a terrible storm that devastated communities on June 9th this year. Reporter Mariah Edgoose with the story.
In the Shire of Yarra Ranges, where extensive damage was caused by a catastrophic storm event in June, the local government is now calling for clarity so it can continue the cleanup. The aftermath of an event of this magnitude means millions of dollars are needed for recovery, and the Yarra Ranges Council says difficult decisions lie ahead if it doesn't receive the state government's support.
Are we going to cut and stop delivering the recovery, or will we, look at cutting operational or capital expenditure, which would impact, the services that residents expect?
While the council says it has received $3.5 million in direct funding so far, its estimated cost of recovery is $65 million. Some of the council's recovery efforts have been underway for some months now without firm assurance of further support, despite the putting forward of business cases for funding consideration.
For us up here, we've had the disaster, the storm event up here. We've been living through COVID, and now we've got straight down the barrel looking at us is bushfire season, and we've got so much timber on the ground.
Further compounding the local devastation has been the closure of many of the area's bush tracks and trails, which are also tourism drawcards. In fact, 373 hectares of land in the Dandenong Ranges National Park was impacted by fallen trees as well as debris in need of clearing. Parks Victoria has been working to make these areas safe once again, and indeed some sites are beginning to reopen in time for spring. But getting the Shire ready for the upcoming season is a mission the council says it can't do alone. Mariah Edgoose for Newsline.
Next up, we hear about urban development in Brunswick.
And later we look to the skies with Captain Kirk. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to Newsline. A group of Brunswick residents is fighting proposed high-rise developments which they say will ruin the suburb's parkland.
It's a challenge many suburbs face as they grapple with gentrification. Ellen Blake with the story.
A walk through the local park for a breath of fresh air has become a necessity in the time of COVID. But a group of Brunswick residents fear two proposed high-rise developments threaten the suburb's green spaces. Property developers Stockland and Mirvac have plans for apartment complexes on Albert Street, which sits between Gilpin and Clifton Parks. Resident group Scale It Down believes the proposed developments will encroach and overshadow the parkland.
Because it will virtually make a 8 to 10 story wall between Gilpin Park and Clifton Park. So we just think for the wildlife, just closing that green belt. So we just think it's too high, and also too many people in what is virtually a heritage area.
The Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal will determine the fates of the buildings later this year, after Moreland City Council rejected the plans. Brunswick MP Dr Tim Reid has called on Planning Minister Richard Wynne to intervene and lower local building heights.
Brunswick doesn't have a lot of green space, and these parks are some of the best we've got in that area. And to block them off with these two big boxes is just wrong for that site.
Residents fear that approval from VCAT will set a dangerous precedent for future residential buildings in the area. As Brunswick is increasingly attracting new residents, there is a growing tension between developments and protecting local amenities.
I support the need for increasing population density in the inner suburbs, but not vastly disproportionate boxes that are away from public transport routes and lower the value of our parks. Not like that.
The VCAT hearings will take place later this year. Ellen Blake, RMIT Newsline.
And now to the skies, where a mysterious radio signal has been found and a famous Star Trek captain has made history. Here's reporter Ivan S. Taylor with more.
Thanks, Faith. William Shatner, the 90-year-old Hollywood actor, best known for his role in Star Trek as Captain Kirk, has fulfilled a lifelong dream by blasting off into the edge of space today. Mr. Shatner has become the oldest person to travel into space, joining 4 other civilian voyages on Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin aircraft. We are now joined by Professor Sarah Webb, an astrophysicist from Swinburne. Sarah, William is 90 years old. What sort of challenges are there for Mr. Shatner going into space?
Sure. So anyone going into space has multiple different challenges that they might face. So age definitely does play a factor into your overall health, but he would have been subject to the same amount of things that any other person going to space would be. And that's to make sure that you're in an overall fit for space health. So are you able to, in case of an emergency, are you able to maneuver yourself, and are you able to help others? And just overall body function, are you good to go? He looked like he was having a ball up there.
Yeah, he sure did, Sarah. And it's only recently that civilians have been able to have the opportunity to go into space. What sort of training would Mr. Shatner and his crew have done leading up to his voyage?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question. So you can't just buy a space ticket, jump on a rocket and go. If you are going to be going past that Kármán line, so that 100 kilometers above the Earth into international space, you have to meet the Federal Aeronautic Association regulations. So this is America-wide. So you need to do at least 14 hours worth of basically coursework to really understand exactly the different factors that are going to be up in space and any emergency procedures. But apart from that, it isn't as heavy by any means compared to a typical astronaut.
And Sarah, there are 3 of the world's biggest billionaires competing in this new era of space tourism. What sort of growth do you think we will see within this area, and what will the environmental costs be like?
Yeah, so this is another great question. So it can be a little discarding when we see just billionaire after billionaire going into space. However, the amount of investment into innovation and technology is brilliant. When we start to think about the environmental factors, there are definitely companies that are doing a better job than others. And we can just break this down into simple things such as fuel. So what type of fuel do they use? And Blue Origin is actually one of the cleanest rockets that you will ever see, because it basically just makes steam. It takes oxygen and hydrogen, what you get in water. So it really isn't too bad for the actual environment compared to something like Virgin Galactic, where you're burning a solid fuel, which does have a lot of pollutants and then more particulates that can enter the atmosphere, which is not so wonderful. But I think in terms of just generally, it won't have a severe impact compared to commercial flight travel for a very long time. I think one of the biggest things for our own footprint on the Earth is commercial flights, which we can't do at the moment. But when we can, I think really considering if they're needed is very important.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Professor Sarah, for your time. Back to you, Matt.
Thanks, Ibanez. Now, students are switching to unscored VCE due to mental health reasons brought on by remote learning. And our very own presenter, Faith Bacale, has a story.
Year 12 students would be applying for university and preparing for their final exams at this time of the year. But this was not the case for Year 12 student Ashley Olleloro. Ashley switched to an unscored VCE a few weeks before VTAC application deadlines.
I feel like exams can sometimes be really overwhelming, and I realized that, it was a lot of unnecessary pressure on me.
For the past 18 months, students have been going on and off campus to have their classes. And for other students, studying online is a much harder challenge. The number of students graduating with unscored VCE has been a steady increase since 2015. In 2020, the Victorian Curriculum and Assessment Authority, or VICA, recorded the highest number of students who went with unscored certificates, which is 4,175. The pandemic has brought on many struggles in the education system, and a lot of students had to adjust from learning in a classroom to tuning into a class in front of a computer. And this has taken effect in the students' mental health, as studying remotely just doesn't give the same effectiveness of a face-to-face class.
There's no stability there, so it was a bit hard. I know that for my peers as well, I could see them slowly starting to lose motivation, and for me it did the same, like I couldn't focus.
A VICA spokesperson said other students may choose not to undertake assessment when their circumstances like illness, disability, or other disruption to their schooling make it difficult to complete a scored VCE program. While obtaining a study score guarantees an application in the university, this is not the only pathway for students. Some students say they would prefer to take other pathways if it means it would cost them less stress and anxiety. Faith Bacale, RMIT Newsline.
We're heading now to a short break. Coming up, we turn to international news from the latest developments from Afghanistan.
And we'll get a check of today's finance, weather, and latest sport. More on that after the break. Welcome back to Newsline. We're joined now by Renee Davidson for a look at the latest international news. Hi Renee, there has been an attack in Norway overnight with 5 people killed. Tell us more.
Yeah, that's right. So a man with a bow and arrow has killed 5 people and wounded 2 others in a Norwegian town just out of Oslo. The man is in custody and the motivation behind the attacks remain unknown. These attacks mark the deadliest in Norway in over a decade.
And the WHO has also just announced a task force to identify the origins of COVID-19. Can you tell us more?
Yeah, sure. So WHO has just announced 26 experts to examine the origins of COVID-19. So while we know that the virus first emerged out of the Chinese city of Wuhan, exactly how it emerged remains unclear. So the task force, the work of that task force, will also contribute to better equipping the world with combating future outbreaks.
And you're looking at developments in Afghanistan, so what can you tell us about those?
Yeah, so the G20 met earlier this week to discuss the unfolding humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. This marked the first time world leaders had convened since the Taliban takeover 2 months ago. Joining me today is Safiya Latay, a researcher at Deakin University's Middle East Studies Forum. Thank you for coming on the program.
Hi, Renee. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. This week, world leaders made a commitment to tackle the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan and pledged over $1 billion in aid. There was also a consensus among world leaders, including the United States, that this might require negotiating with the Taliban. Now, the United States has been at war with the Taliban for 20 years, and Washington has not officially recognized the Taliban as the new Afghan government. What do you think is the most effective way for the US to negotiate with the Taliban, given its long-standing policy of not engaging with terrorist organizations?
That's a very good question, Renee. First of all, we need to be aware that some could perhaps argue that Taliban has cleared their names from being a terrorist organization by just engaging with the United States, with UN officials and with a lot of neighboring countries around Afghanistan. However, some of the main or key figures of the Taliban organization still remain on the UN terrorist list. So you could perhaps argue that it is still a terrorist organization, but I think it would be much more appropriate to use Taliban as an insurgent group who have used the means of power or force to gain control over Afghanistan. And secondly, also, we need to distinguish between humanitarian and non-humanitarian or development aid. So when it comes to negotiations with the Taliban, there is a major difference between conventional diplomacy and humanitarian diplomacy. And development aid can be used as a foreign policy. Certainly, the humanitarian assistance, which in this case, the European Union and the United States have offered, should not be used as a political tool. However, it shouldn't also be given to Taliban as a blank check for them to use it for whatever the means that they want. So in a way, if the aid is used in any way to strengthen the Taliban's forces or oppressing the people, and most importantly to continue their autocratic, theocratic, and ethnocentric policies, it should definitely be avoided.
Thank you. And the Taliban, so we know the Taliban wants legitimacy and assistance to combat the economic crisis. Do you think international aid can be used as leverage to moderate the Taliban's behavior?
So normally aid conditionality is something that has been practiced by a lot of donors. But what the problem is that that is usually happening in the cases where at least the governments are popular or democratic. Taliban are not a popular government, clearly, even if they claim to be a government. They're not recognized by anyone, not even by the Afghans themselves. The latest surveys in 2020 show that 85% of the Afghans did not approve of the Taliban as an organization, or especially as a government, as a group to come back and rule over the country. So in a way, humanitarian organizations, the best way to, in a way, to use that to deliver aid would be using through international organizations such as ICRC, Doctors Without Borders, MSF, as they're known, Save the Children, and other organizations. But it's also the idea that, even the humanitarian aid, in a way, should be used as a way of forcing the Taliban to uphold to their commitments and the promises they have made, especially with the human rights, giving the ability for women and to go back to work, for girls to go back to school, and establish an inclusive government. And these are some of the things that the international community must speak very clearly with the Taliban about before providing any assistance to them.
Thank you. And so now turning to Australia, a Senate hearing earlier this week, revealed that more than 100,000 Afghans have applied for a humanitarian visa to Australia. I understand also that you're trying to secure a humanitarian visa for your brother who is, in Afghanistan at the moment. What has this process been like?
Well, it has been a very, in a way, tedious and also very unclear policy. Well, first of all, let's look at what the numbers are showing in terms of the applicants themselves. Australia has been one of the top 10 donors in Afghanistan since 2001. It has had a very strong military presence in the country. It has worked with many actors, including civil societies, and it was in charge of a province in Afghanistan as part of the provincial reconstruction teams. It spent nearly 1.5 billion of its overseas development assistance to Afghanistan. So Australia cannot just, promises 3,000, visas for a country that, at least I think thousands and thousands of people were working directly with Australia. But more importantly, Australia has also worked in promising, equality and invested a lot on women's affairs in the country. So by just showing a small number of visas, it cannot get off the hook in a way. So the country has larger responsibilities, bigger responsibilities in extending its humanitarian assistance to the country at this point, and of course the humanitarian visas. So regardless of just one specific case that I have, and I don't want to talk about my personal case for many reasons, but I think there's a lot of lack of information for a lot of Afghans here who want to bring their family members or they want to bring their close ones to the country. There are some reports that people are desperately reaching to some lawyers. They spend up to $10,000 to $20,000 just to get an application. So this shows that this whole system is very unclear. But more importantly, given Australia's level of commitment to Afghanistan, it has to match countries like Canada and the United Kingdom who have, extended their visas for up to 20 to 40,000 people. Australia has to do the same. 3,000 is clearly not going to, with the demand that it is, it's clearly not going to answer anything.
Thank you, Safi, and I wish you all the best with your brother's application, and thank you so much for your time today.
Of course. Thank you, guys.
All right, well, thanks for that international update, Renee. It was really informative. I really appreciated that. Now we're going to move on to sport with our reporter, Sam Matthews. Sam, what's the latest?
Well, the AFL trade period ended last night at 7:30 with plenty of 11th hour action. It was a big night for the big men, with Darcy Fort going from Geelong to Brisbane, John Segler from Hawthorn to Geelong, Max Lynch from Collingwood to Hawthorn, and Peter Laddams from Port to Sydney. A few big trades fell through as well. Fremantle tall Rory Lobb will not return to his former team GWS, as many speculated he would. And Bobby Hill will remain a Giant. GWS rejected Essendon's offer of a future second-round pick for the 21-year-old expectant father. Hill requested a trade on compassionate grounds to be closer to family. And after soccer, Sydney Siders have plenty to look forward to coming out of lockdown. The Matildas' two-match series against Brazil will kick off next Saturday with up to 22,500 fans in the stands. New South Wales Sports Minister Natalie Ward signed off on the exemption last night, upping the allowed capacity for CommBank Stadium to 75%. And this is good news for the Socceroos as well, who are slated to play Saudi Arabia at home on November 11. Coach Graham Arnold recently appealed to the New South Wales government to allow crowds after the Socceroos' recent loss to Japan in the World Cup qualifiers. Arnold said the support of the Japanese crowd was influential. But the good news for sports fans in Sydney doesn't stop there. Native Sydney-sider and super welterweight boxer Tim Tszyu will be taking on Takeshi Inoue at Kudos Bank Arena on the 17th of November. The match was moved from the Gold Coast after COVID restrictions in Queensland tightened. And the Everest racing event this weekend will be the first live sporting event since the latest lockdown. 10,000 spectators have been given the go-ahead to attend the Royal Randwick this Saturday. Favoured horses are last year's winner Classic Legend and rising star Nature Strip. Melbourne's first foray into live sport after lockdown is expected to be the Melbourne Cup, after 10,000 fans are expected to be welcomed to Flemington Racecourse on the first Tuesday of November. And rugby league legend Norm Provan has died at the age of 89. Widely regarded as one of the greatest players of all time, Provan played 256 games for the St George's Dragons between 1951 and 1965 and won 10 consecutive premierships. And that's all for sport. Back to you, Faith.
Thanks, Sam. Now to finance with Marie Stella.
Marie, what's going on with the markets today?
Thanks, Matt. I will tell you. In today's stock market, ASX 200 observed an increase of 0.6% following rises on Wall Street and in Europe. Dow Jones saw a decrease of 0.53%. The Nasdaq is also down by 0.03%, and Nikkei saw a decrease as well by 0.32%. Moving on to the currencies, the Australian dollar is slightly up, buying 74 US cents, $1.06 New Zealand cents, 64 euro cents, just over 83.5 yen, and 54 British pence. Onto commodities, with gold trading at 2,429 Australian dollars an ounce, an increase of just over 1.8%. Silver also climbed 2.3% and is now just at over $31 an ounce. Brent crude oil is down by 0.29%, with WTI crude oil up by 0.25%. In today's financial news, the ABC reports 2 major Australian banks have mandated COVID-19 vaccines for staff to protect the safety of employees and customers. Westpac and CBA will require its staff to be fully vaccinated, affecting about 75,000 employees around the country. Meanwhile, NAB and ANZ are not currently planning to mandate the COVID-19 vaccination. That's it for finance. Back to you, Faith and Matt.
Thanks, Marie. So we're heading to a short break now. Coming up after the break, we take a look at how to get your home cooking onto the supermarket shelves.
And we take a look at the latest weather with Marie Stella. Back with you soon.
Welcome back. You're watching Newsline. I'm Matt Harvey.
And I'm Faith Makale.
Have you even thought about producing your own food product? In the pandemic has seen a rise in a number of people who are creating food products for both the domestic and overseas market. Jackie Hicken investigates.
The pandemic has seen the number of people that put spoon to bowl or flame to saucepan to create their own food product grow. Jane Del Rosso, the director of the Business of Food, has seen this growth.
People are stuck at home, so they're finding that they do have time if they've lost their job or they've experienced a downturn in what they would normally be able to do. They suddenly have time to think about a new venture.
In the Food and Beverage National Manufacturing Priority Roadmap, one area of opportunity there is for the Australian sector is in convenience meals and premium ready-to-eat products.
We've seen an increase in convenient foods. So things like falafel mixes where you just add water, or baking mixes where you can get the kids involved.
One of those people that was made redundant due to the pandemic was Mona Limani, who turned her background in science into a convenient, just add water falafel mix.
So I've got a beetroot falafel mix and I've got a pumpkin falafel mix. And I've also got, so just the original as well, and onion and garlic free. They are gluten free, they're vegan, there's no preservatives.
Australia exports over 90% of what we produce. It is expected that the Australian food industry may be a $200 billion opportunity for Australia by 2030.
In the COVID times when we can't travel, there was a high demand for Australian products, in particular dairy-related products, meat, not just raw meat, but packaged meat, processed products, but also healthy products as well, ready-made meals and so forth. There's a real demand, particularly in Asia and the Middle East, for these products.
I'd like to see it on as many retail shelves as possible, and we're both in Victoria and interstate and overseas.
So now is the time to put spoon to bowl or flame to saucepan and create our own food product. Jackie Hicken reporting for RMIT Newsline.
Now to weather from Melbourne and around the country with reporter Marie Stella.
Thanks, Faith. Today, Melbourne will see evening showers that may drag out through the night with a 54% chance of rain, a high of 18 and a low of 9. To capital cities around Australia, tomorrow in Melbourne, it will be cloudy without a chance of meatballs, unfortunately. With rain, highly likely. Expect a top of 16 and a low of 11. Sydney-siders should expect scattered thunderstorms with a 61% chance of rain and a top of 21. Showers and morning thunderstorms in Brisbane, a top of 24. Over in Adelaide, there'll be morning showers with a top of 17. Some good news out west, as Perth will be mostly sunny, top of 31. In Darwin, partly cloudy with a low chance of rain and a high of 34. It'll be a somber Friday in Hobart as showers prevail throughout the day with a 95% chance of rain and a top of 16. And in the nation's capital, Canberra will face some light rain with a low of 6 and a high of 13 degrees. And that's the weather around the country. Now to the next 7 days forecast for Melbourne, cloudy with a high chance of rain on Friday and Saturday, tops of 16 and 15. On Sunday and Monday, it will be partly cloudy with a low chance of rain, and on Tuesday, we'll see quite a bit of sun with a top of 22 degrees. But the sun's not here to stay, as the skies will turn cloudy once again toward the end of the week. That's all for the weather. Back to you, Faith and Matt.
Thanks, Marie. That concludes Newsline for today. Thank you for joining us. I'm Faith Makale.
And I'm Matt Harvey. Thanks to our reporters, Sarah Lipsitch, Emil Pavlich, Ibanez Taylor, Renee Davidson, Sam Matthews, and Marie Stella. Our producers are Jackie Hicken and Jude Ellison.
Stay safe out there. See you next time.